much, and thanks for having me. And Paul and Courtney, it's nice to be here with you guys too. So look, I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about what's been going on in Canada regarding this latest piece of public policy addressed at journalism. Paul, I'm sure, can go into it in more detail, but I thought I could just kind of sketch the landscape in which it was introduced, how it's differed a little bit from the Australian model, which you talked about last week, and how some of the debate has played out about it in Canada. Because I think it's quite telling how various actors have responded to the introduction of this bill in Canada. But first, I think there's some attributes. I mean, obviously, every journalism ecosystem has similarities and differences. And a couple of things are important at the moment in the Canadian media ecosystem that are relevant to I think, the tabling of this bill and how it's being received. One is, of course, just the decline in Canadian news publishers that we're seeing in other markets. I mean, there's nothing particularly unique about the Canadian news market, except that it has been a more difficult space for independents and digital companies to emerge than I would argue the US, in part because of the nature of digital commercial models for journalism that demand a certain kind of scale that Canada just hasn't been able to match. So we've seen a real decline in publishers, both legacy and more broadly, and not the same kind of digital ecosystem replace that market as you have in some other places. Second reality is that in response to the Australian bargaining code, the tech platforms in Canada have entered into deals with some Canadian publishers. These deals are unknown to the public. They're behind NDAs, and they are with some publishers and not all of them at the discretion of the platforms. Some of them are general, from what we know, are general licensing agreements or payment deals. Some are programmatic in that the platforms actually have some say in what kind of content is produced with those funds. So one of the baseline realities in Canada is not a world in which there are no deals between publishers and platforms, but actually where there are opaque and unaccountable deals between platforms and some publishers. And that's actually a really important piece of the reality, I think, when we assess the Canadian version of the Online News Act. The final piece is that there actually is already existing policy from the federal government to assist journalism as well. So in 2019, the federal government introduced 4 mechanisms. They expanded our charitable status to apply to journalistic organizations. They gave a subscription tax credit to offset some of the costs of subscriptions. There's a fund for local journalism, and perhaps most importantly to this conversation, there is a labor tax subsidy on journalistic labor for qualifying journalism organizations. And this is 25% of journalistic labor can be offset through a tax subsidy, which is actually a fairly significant mechanism, which I'm happy to talk more about as well. Okay, so a few quick differences between the Australian code. Rather than explaining all the details of the act here, let me say a few things about how it's different than Australia, since you guys talked about that last week. The first big one is that it's overseen by a regulator rather than a competition commissioner. So it is a very similar model to Australia, sort of the forced arbitration mechanism, but it is overseen by our broadcast regulator rather than through the lens of a competition bureau. And I think this actually both complicates it and opens up a whole host of regulatory mechanisms, one of which is a far more detailed exemption criteria. So one of the real critiques of the Australian code was that the mechanism for exempting from designation was very crude and ill-defined. We do not know the terms on which that decision was made. And that's actually the biggest piece of this entire policy initiative, is that moment of decision of exemption from designation is the one big piece of policy policy intervention that the government has. And so what the Canadian bill has done is put specified criteria on that exemption. And they include fair compensation, so everybody's getting some sort of similar amount. that the money get used for local regional news and regional news content, some degree of journalistic independence inside the deals, like written into the deals, that a significant portion of the deals go to independent publishers, and there's a degree of diversity of all kinds in terms of the distribution of these deals across the country, language, regional, ethnic diversity. So like that's a very important thing that I actually think is going to be mimicked by other countries who may or follow sort of similar policy paths. A few other quick differences. The bill has defined what a qualifying journalistic organization is, going down quite small, and that's now being amended to be even smaller. One proprietor and one full-time journalist. This creates all sorts of challenges, which we can talk about. There is greater transparency built into the Canadian bill than the Australian one. This is tricky because while many people have asked for full transparency of these deals, given that they're mandated by a piece of public policy, one could maybe expect that they be fully transparent. On the other hand, these are deals between two commercial actors, and there are a host of legal and particularly trade restrictions on forcing transparency of market information. So what the Canadian bill has done essentially said that the regulator needs to have access to the details of the deals. This is not the case in Australia, to its detriment, I would argue. The regulator uses that information about those deals to do two things: to, if it ends up in forced arbitration, in order to see the fairness of the deals compared to others, right? To evaluate the best offers from the two parties, they need access to the deals that other people have received, so they'll have that. And also, more importantly, to adjudicate whether a platform will be designated or not. So they will get access to all of the suite of deals that have been done, and they can see if they meet those exemption criteria. All of this then gets reported in some degree of frequency, it's being debated right now, to the public in an aggregated way. So the public has like some sense of where money's flowing, how, and under what conditions. Finally, there's two other things quickly. There's an accountability mechanism, I think, that makes it somewhat more accountable than the Australian bill. Some of the designation hearings, some part of that process is going to be held in public. So this is going to be something that Canadian citizens are going to get to window into the arguments of both sides. And designation is not a permanent status. It's something that can be reviewed, which I think is really important. Finally, publishers, we do have a collective bargaining component of this as well, but different from Australia, publishers can join collectives after they've been formed and entered into deals. So this, I think, opens ideally the model up to many more publishers who may not be involved in the initial negotiations for deals. Okay. So that's kind of different to Australia. So how does this play out in Canada? Let me just sort of close with a few comments on that. So it's been I think it's quite instructive and tells us a lot about both this policy lever and how different players in this debate see it. So Google has used, in my view, and these are my personal beliefs here, in my view, a strategy that sought to divide publishers against each other in response to this bill. So they have been engaging with and supporting networks of small and independent publishers, and with them making the argument that this bill will disproportionately advantage the large publishers and legacy publishers. I think there's a reasonable debate about that. I think many of the facts on which they are making that debate are wrong and are not reflected in the bill. I think Paul can probably speak to this in more detail than I can. But in my view, it's quite telling about the role they see themselves having in this ecosystem, that really they are fostering what has become quite a acrimonious debate between journalistic publishers, which is a pretty unfortunate consequence of the debate we've had in the last year in Canada over this bill. Facebook has done essentially what they threatened to do in Australia and are threatening to do in the US as well, which is to turn off access to news links on their site, should the bill come to pass. They have made this in public and in front of parliamentary committee in Canada, so it seems like an official position. We can talk about what the consequences of that are. My view is I'm not sure it's possible. I think it may be possible in one market with a small set of publishers. I'm not convinced of the logistics, let alone the strategy of doing it in multiple markets around the world, and how that would even be possible. But that's the threat. It's on the table. Another reaction, which has been interesting, and I think shows you goes back to one of that initial points I made, which was that some publishers have deals, is some publishers who have deals no longer have the same kind of support they may have once had for this piece of public policy, which actually shows you the reason why those deals were put in place in the first place. If one has a deal with Facebook or Google that it lasts some number of years, and that puts you at an advantage over your competitors who do not have them, you might be less likely to support a policy that will democratize or open up access to the very same deal you have. And we've seen that, which is pretty unfortunate in my view, for a host of reasons. And I think actually the publishers and Google in this case particularly are to blame for this end result. The two final sort of reflections on where we are in Canada. Like, this bill's going to pass, in my view, in the new year. It will come into effect. Maybe Paul will have some clear ideas for when, but I do think it's going to happen. It's in committee right now, and there's some debates over some details of it, and there'll be more debates in our Senate in the new year. But I think it's highly likely to pass. But two broad sort of reflections about that. One is we will likely be in a situation in Canada where close to 50% of journalistic labor is subsidized by either the federal government through the labor tax subsidy or platforms through this code. And that to me is not an ideal situation. And that is, so the next big public policy challenge in Canada for journalism is going to be what you do about that, and what effect that is having on the journalistic market, and how do we move beyond that. This might be an okay stopgap measure for an industry that's in real decline, but it is not a permanent solution, and is not one we should want. And we need to sort of be clear about that. The second is a final comment about the reaction of the platforms to the Canadian debate. And this, I think, ties into the Indian conversation too. I don't think Facebook or Google care about the Canadian market in any sort of significant way. Canada imposing this code will cost some number of hundreds of millions of dollars, which both companies can easily absorb. But they are fighting the bill in Canada incredibly aggressively, particularly Google, which is, I think, behaving in a way that they are not either accustomed or particularly happy about doing, frankly. They're not acting like a responsible policy actor in Canada at the moment, in my view. And I think they're fighting it so aggressively, not because of Canada, because the Canadian bill actually builds and makes the Australian bill better. And it shows that there's a degree of policy iteration in this space happening, where governments are starting to learn from each other. And my view is this model could really take off in the next year. So in part because it is getting better, and the governments are addressing some of the problems with the original Australian code, which in my view did have some fundamental problems. So in closing, I don't think Google cares and Facebook care about the Canadian market and 40 million people in Canada. But if in the next year, South Africa, Germany, the UK, Brazil, and others potentially all implement a similar policy, that really does start to matter. You're then in a universe where there's 1 billion or 2 billion people under some sort of similar policy framework. And you better believe that matters. And that could lead to billions of dollars of transfer from publishers, from platforms to publishers, which makes me feel like if that's going to happen, we better ensure that the mechanism through which that money is being transferred from these large platforms to publishers is done so in a way that is as accountable and democratic as possible. Because that's where our attention should focus, is on ensuring these bills have accountability, transparency, and some degree of democratic legitimacy built into them. And I think the Canadian one gets that, moves that ball forward a little bit.